CRE Power Panel. We have some incredible panelists, as I've said. I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves so that it's not just me yapping up here. We'll start with the wonderful woman that I just admire and so much, Miss Claire Roberts.
Thank you. I thought you were speaking about Jessica. Claire Roberts, I'm with Colliers here in Minneapolis, and I work mostly on office, but have done most recently a lot of industrial deals, been around the marketplace for in the business for about 26 years, started my career in Southeast Michigan and have been in Minnesota for the past 14 years. Had the pleasure of getting to know Natalie, mostly through CRE.
CRE sister, yep. Jeff Tabor.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jeff Tabor. I have my own firm based in Orange County. I focus on tenant representation, office only, and primarily law firms in from Century City to downtown LA, Orange County, and through San Diego. I've been doing this for 35 plus years now, and enjoy every minute of it.
And he's amazing to work with, just incredible. And how about you? I'm going in order on my screen. So Gabe Marans, sir. I didn't pronounce your last name wrong, didn't I?
You can call me whatever you want to call me. It's people have been getting it wrong since the beginning of time. I think
I know,
actually,
but I like adore you. I'm awful.
I think we pronounce it Marans because that's the way the guy at Ellis Island pronounced it, but who the hell knows? So you can call me whatever you want to call me. But Gabe Marans with Savills in New York. For those of you familiar with the firm, we're tenant rep only in North America, but global around the world. I've gotten to know some of these people on the call on this panel over the last few months, and it's just really, it's incredible to see this developing and continue developing CRE community. And I give Natalie, you all the credit in the world for helping to spearhead that. So thanks for having me this time and always.
Always. And Jessica Mauser.
Hello. Thank you for having me. I feel honored to be joining the second round of what is already a popular panel. So I'm super excited to be here. I'm Jessica Mauser. I'm just outside of the San Francisco area and the suburban market of Pleasanton, California. I've been in commercial real estate for 16 years now. I also run the Lee & Associates Pleasanton office. And I sit on the board of directors for Lee & Associates nationally. For those who don't know much about Lee, Lee is a 68 strong presence across the US with about 1,200 agents at this time. And we cross all product types, office, industrial, retail. I myself am primarily a retail broker.
And Mr. Lance Duke, our only non-broker.
The only non-broker. Thank you for having me. So I'm Lance Duke. I'm a CPA CA, and my business is CRE Advisory Services. And all we do is lease audit representing tenants. So as you can appreciate, we're quite busy. Tenants really need all the help they can get in assessing what has been charged, helping the landlords figure out how to apply the often complex lease language and interpretations that are required to make sure that the operating costs are charged in accordance with the lease industry practices and are reasonable. And so that is what I do for clients across the United States and Canada.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Natalie Wainwright. I am an exclusive tenant rep in Nevada, serving both Las Vegas and Reno. This is a continuation of the new to CRE Power Panel #1, how to review a lease. We found, oddly enough, that in an hour and a half, we couldn't review an entire lease with these brilliant minds telling us all the things to look out for while we're looking for it. And if you're new to this business or you've been in it for a few years, you're going to learn something today from the people on this panel. And why do I do it? Because I want to be surrounded by the best. I want to continue to learn always, always. And you have some minds that have been in the business, like they said, for years and years. And I continue to be impressed and so thankful that they're willing to give their time so the rest of us can be better in our industries, at our shops. It doesn't matter what shop you're at. And these brokers and Lance Duke were chosen because they're kind and they care about our industry. So if you have a follow-up question, I guarantee you that everybody up here is going to answer your email, your LinkedIn message, and that's why they were selected, because of who they are as people. and as brokers. So with that, we're going to do how to review a lease part 2. We're going to be better. I'm going to be better about answering the questions down below or asking our panelists on your behalf. So we have some chats going back and forth. Make sure to utilize that chat box, share your handles, and get to know each other. That's another great part of all connecting on here. And then use the Q&A feature, guys. That's going to be easier for me to track everything while I'm also trying to do everything else. Q&A down at the bottom so that I can see what question and we can make sure we get those answered. Okay, with that, we're going to hop into our screen share. Unless does anybody on our panel have anything they want to say or ask before we get going? No? Get to it, lady. All right, here we go. Okay, now last time we ended with section 7.2. So we're going to go ahead and just dive right in. I'm not sure why it was not like this previously. Thank you, MacBook. We're going to go ahead and jump into alterations, section 8. Can you see my screen? I need someone to give me feedback. You can see section 8. Do you want me to?
You have a book view. Natalie, if you're, you have book view. If you click on the down select under view, a little bit to the left to zoom.
A single page.
Single page.
Look at this. I need you with me always, Gabe. Just help me out. Okay, here we go. Okay, we're on section 8, alterations. So the alterations clause, who wants to kick us off? Panelists.
I like to address this. This is oftentimes a profit center potential for a landlord and would come out of the tenant's pocket. For example, they often charge a percentage of the cost of the alterations. First of all, they need to get their approval for alterations, particularly on base building work, fire and life safety stuff. But also, they try to ding the tenant a certain percentage on up to 10% of any, or even 15% on alterations. So what I try to do is, number one, require that we do not need to get landlord approval if it's cosmetic alterations, i.e. wall covering, painting, any carpeting, some flooring, etc. And any cosmetic alterations wouldn't have any landlord fee associated with it. Anything that would involve non-cosmetic, such as structural, electrical, mechanical, we would have some kind of a fee associated with that to the landlord, but it would be a negotiated fee. It wouldn't be what they're asking for. It'd be a much smaller amount and maybe on a scaled basis, given the amount of the improvement costs.
Okay, that's really smart. So get rid of that fee if it's cosmetic. You don't need the landlord involved.
Correct.
Would you say to strike this first line without prior consent? Would you kind of add some language there to say, hey, if it's cosmetic, I don't need your consent?
Correct. That's how I would do it.
Okay. So
Natalie, I would also add a dollar amount in there that's appropriate for the submarket where this is being written. So to Jeff's point, non-structural changes, and then maybe even putting in a dollar amount. So maybe they're going to add one wall. Does that really need a landlord approval to add one wall?
So you heard that, everybody. Really pay attention to this language. And then section 8.2 is also something that you want to pay attention to. Removal and surrender of fixtures and tenant alterations. You would have hit this in your proposal when you're working with your client and the landlord, to where there is no restoration at the end of the lease, meaning that if whatever you put into the space, you move walls or put up walls, you don't have to then put it back to its original condition. So that's what this clause is addressing. Anything in here that stands out?
Well, in general, the restoration clauses really get me upset. Where depending on the type of work that you're doing, you need to think about what it's going to cost to put this back to base building if that's a requirement. Best case scenario is you never have to put this back to base building. You can make your alterations, redo the layout, add your finishings and fixtures, and at the end of the lease, you just give it back to the landlord as is. Yeah. Because quite honestly, there's very likely, if you're exiting the premises and you've done a nice job, another tenant will come in and love what you've done. Maybe they'll tweak the colors here and there, but they may love it. So when the lease says you have to put it back to base building or pay the landlord to do so, most tenants leave it till the very end to move out of their premises and end up cutting a check to the landlord for the estimate of what it would cost to put back to base building. But we all know, playing devil's advocate, that that's probably not going to be turned back to base building. So it becomes a profit center to the landlord.
So Lance, and to piggyback on that, I mean, there are two ways of expounding on that. So number one, you should dictate to the landlord at what point they have to tell you what you should be moving. So that's a nice way of handling that. So say 90 days, 180 days before the end of the lease, landlord has to walk the space and identify if you're able to leave anything behind. And the second thing, which is a variation of this provision, if you are subleasing space and you're going to be getting furniture as part of that, oftentimes you'll see that written about who owns the furniture. This is an instance where if this is a sublease and you're taking ownership of the furniture, you're going to be financially responsible for moving it. Whereas if you are renting the furniture, oftentimes it's still incumbent on the sublandlord to remove it at the end of the term. So depending on what you're dealing with here, there are a lot of costs that could be hidden in this provision that you might not be thinking of.
Yeah, and I'll add in that on a practical matter, do you have to worry about this in a standard office lease if you're moving into a space where you aren't completing any work and you're taking the space as is? Absolutely, it's something to look over, but it won't be as applicable. If you're working with, say, a dentist, a medical user who's building out a space, pulling plumbing into various operatories, even a hair salon or a restaurant where there is very heavy amount of improvements and fixtures and alterations that are happening within that space. Be very wary of 8.2. Removal and surrender of fixtures does become, as Gabe just mentioned here, you want to have a date where you walk through with the landlord if they really are going to enforce that you have to remove fixtures after the fact. If you're removing hoods, if you're removing sinks, if you're having to get into plumbing, if you're a dentist, these become very, very expensive at the end of a lease. So there are certain tenants that this will be much more applicable to than others. So know what type of tenant you have and understand what their build out is going to be as you're reading through this lease to either red flag it or yellow flag it as you're moving through a lease document.
Okay, I love that. And I'm taking notes for everybody in the audience so that way we can time check where, because I guarantee you just heard something and you're like, ooh, didn't know. Need to look back at my lease that I'm reviewing right now for my tenant. And you both. So I will be doing a little time marker for the YouTube video. And to answer the question right now in the question box, yes, video 1 is available on YouTube under the new to CRE series. So if you go in there and type it, and I can share the link later, and it's on LinkedIn. So yes, absolutely. And so would you recommend in 8.2 to put that day, that time period in there, Gabe, that you mentioned? Would you say, 90 to 180 days, you would insert that language into 8.2?
Yes. I would try to do that. And in the chat feature, Tim Farley makes a good point, which he's referencing specialty alterations. So there's a treatment of improvements that are made at the beginning of a lease term as part of either landlord's delivery conditions or initial construction. And then you have alterations that happen after the initial construction. In the event that you make alterations, which we talked about earlier, you should ask the landlord to identify if it's a specialty alteration that you would be required to remove at the end of term. In New York, for instance, those would include showers, reinforced floors, internal stairs, things that to restore are not typically expected from the landlord's angle.
Okay. And I have a great question. And Tim Farley, by the way, hello, sir. I'm so happy to have you in the audience, and he's incredible. So I love that he's, given us some wisdom as well. Michael Easton asks, do these modifications become capital improvements, and would removal change the value? Great question, Michael.
If it's movable, this is really an accounting question. If you're talking about fixtures that are affixed to the installation, you're probably not going to move it. If it's furniture, et cetera, it has a different depreciation schedule, and probably the answer to that is yes.
Hey, Natalie, one last quick thing.
Yes.
Well, we've been seeing, due to years and years of wiring, is a lot of these leases now require that the tenant at landlord's discretion may or may not have to remove all wiring they installed. Older buildings were seeing sagging ceilings because so many tenants' wiring was still in the ceiling grid. So a lot of landlords are now asking for wiring to be removed, low voltage. And in this submarket, that's pretty standard.
Okay, so you're having your tenant agree to that, to remove their wiring, their data?
Yeah, that's the kind of standard around our market as well.
Yeah,
Wire
it's
removal.
just it became problematic, especially in older buildings.
Okay,
Continue the dialogue on data. So a lot of my clients have office space where you've got the server rooms
Yes.
that require supplemental cooling.
Yeah.
And so the tenant needs to install either its own dedicated HVAC units that are running off a chiller, or they're running off a closed loop of chilled water of some sort. Those obviously would be much more expensive to restore and remove on vacating the premises. Who owns that equipment? So you just got to be specific in terms of how painful is it going to be to exit the space efficiently, and a restoration provision can make it very onerous to leave space and move to another building. If you have to, if you have months of restoration work, that would mean that you actually have to exit your premises and have a lot of overlap between the old space and the new space. So it's just additional considerations to keep in mind how much, how onerous the restoration provisions are going to be at the end of your lease.
yeah,
And it's always better to have no restoration requirements at all. Just negotiate as one of the terms, because to leave your space and not have to worry about anything, it just makes life so much easier.
it's a really important clause.
I don't know about other markets, but in Southern California, virtually every lease these days has a requirement the tenant has to remove their IT and data cabling at the end of the lease.
That's my point, Jeff.
And it's not an illegitimate request, because the cable, if it's a 5-year lease, the IT data cabling is virtually outdated anyway. So a new tenant's going to have new stuff to go in. So why should the landlord have to remove basically personal property of a prior tenant at their expense? It should be the tenant's expense anyway, but it is a negotiated item from time to time.
Okay, we're gonna move on to maintenance and repairs. This is also a very important one. I've heard a lot of horror stories where this was not properly discussed in lease negotiations, and then the tenant ends up holding the bag. So 9.1 is tenant obligations. They are discussing, it looks like they are discussing kind of a little bit about what's going on in 8.2. So keep the premises in good repair, no obligation to alter, remodel, or improve. Tenant shall reimburse landlord for all repairs to the building or any other portion of the project which are required as a result of misuse or neglect. That's pretty standard at any lease. Anything in here that you would insert or strike to protect your client? And I'm looking at this from a tenant rep brain, because that's all I have. And that's not the way I mean to be doing this. So I apologize if that's all I know. And then look, it's a bunch of tenant rep brokers. I just thought about that. I need to do a better job. So if anybody's looking at this as a landlord rep as well, please feel free to insert your comment. I just realized that.
My concern here is not on the language of the lease that's in front of us, but who the landlord is or will be. And you just need to be cognizant of who you're about to rent from. And does that landlord have sufficient cash flow to properly keep this building up? Or, you may want to have go to the extent, this is a sort of a side note, but on the tax side of things, often cases buildings are heavily reassessed with increased values on a sale. So that's a whole different subject altogether, is limiting the exposure to the tenant after a sale. But I'm more thinking of requiring the landlord to sell to a landlord that is equal to or better in terms of financial position it's hard to articulate this, but I've got a few clients where the landlords just don't have the funds to change the roof and upgrade the HVAC. And so my clients who are anchor tenants who want to stay in the building are actually footing the bill and having to work out agreements that they're going to fund if they own the equipment. It's getting very convoluted and expensive. So if you're renting from a major landlord, Hines or Boston Properties, this is not going to be an issue. But what if they sell to a smaller landlord that just doesn't have the funds to keep up the building? And that would be my only concern in terms of landlord obligation.
Okay, and it also, in section 9. If we move on to section 9.2 under landlord obligation, it says that shall be no abatement of rent. How do we all feel about that? If something breaks and we aren't able to properly use our space and there's no rental abatement, how do we protect our client in this clause?
Well, the way I do it is several ways. One or two ways, at least, that if the landlord fails to make a repair to the extent that repair not being made materially and detrimentally affects tenant's business. In other words, the tenant can't conduct business. Let's say the air conditioning goes out in New York in the summer. Nobody can work. It's too hot inside the space. So the tenant has to let their employees go. They can't function. I put language in the lease that after 3 days, for every day they cannot, every day the repair is not made by the landlord, they get a like-kind day of rental abatement, number one. Number two, I also put what's called a tenant self-help right in there. In other words, after the tenant has constructively notified the landlord of the lack of their need for repair, the landlord's obligations, and then let's say the landlord's not performing. Let's say the building's in bankruptcy, and so the highest and best use of the landlord is not to attend to the needs of the tenant, it's to do other things. And so the tenant has a right to actually, after a suitable notice to the landlord, to go in and make the repairs themselves, so long as they're insured and bonded, and the cost of which the tenant can offset from rent. It's basically called a tenant self-help right.
Yeah, it definitely what I would completely agree with Jeff on this. There should be the tenant's ability to fix, given notice, obviously, to the landlord, and that self-help is definitely something we see, especially in restaurant leases or leases that where you have an establishment that may have emergency off hours types of situations that come up, and the landlord may not be available for. That could be a water pipe breaking in the middle of service or something along those lines. So it's very important that tenants have the ability to self-help.
Jessica, I gotta voice the position of the landlord community, which I've had the benefit of never sitting in, but I know that they say the following. So how would you respond to it? Why do you need any sort of penalty here? Isn't that the whole intent of business interruption insurance?
Sure. If you want to start getting into business interruption insurance and how long is that going to take you to rectify versus getting a plumber on site to fix a pipe, and so you can be open for business. I mean, that's just adding more money onto everybody's plate, more disruption. So if it's an easy enough fix that you can get a bonded and licensed plumber, for example, out there, why wouldn't you go the high road of just getting that taken care of rather than trying to run through insurance? We all know insurance isn't exactly the easiest route to get reimbursement from.
Good answer.
Oh, boom.
That's a
Gabe.
good answer.
There you go. With that, she didn't.
Listen, I'm speechless and I'm not on mute. So
I may not be from New York, but I'm from San Francisco. So, you know, we got our own little.
Yeah, Jessica is the bomb. Patrice, I noticed that you're raising your hand. I apologize. I'm not too familiar with that feature. So if you could ask your question in the Q&A or message me privately, but I am screen sharing. So but I would use the Q&A feature. I don't know about the raising hand feature. I apologize. So just to say that, I don't want you to think that I'm ignoring you on purpose. So we covered 8.2, 9.1 and 9.2. If you have any additional questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. And then we have a couple of strong brokers in the chat box also adding some dialogue. So take notes of that, guys. Section 10, do we want to go over this? Or do we, and I don't want to go over insurance for sure. I think that that's something that we leave to the insurance agent. But what about section 10?
Yeah, 10.1, oftentimes the landlords state that the tenant also has to pay taxes to the extent the landlords assess those taxes on any above standard improvements. So when I put language in the lease that I have the landlord acknowledge at the end of the day, any and all improvements in the space, such as whatever specified in the work letter, the builder suit is represented as quote unquote building standard, even if some things aren't building standard. Just so the tenant doesn't get dinged later on, the assessor walks in and finds that their space is should be more assessed because there's more improvements in there. We shove that burden to the landlord.
Okay, anything else to add on section 10.2? Henry has something to add. No? Okay.
Real quick on just the insurance, not to get into insurance, but I just wanted to point out the $1 million on the general liability. I'm seeing that really change in the last 2 to 3 years, especially in new construction and mixed use projects. I'm now seeing more along the lines of $3 and $5 million aggregates on those, just as a general note on that section. So don't be surprised if you are starting to see those policy limits be increased, especially on newer projects where you've got higher construction costs or multi-use projects.
Okay, thank you. And we're actually starting to see that in this market as well. Fire and casualty, this is another important one for everybody to pay attention to. Damage to premises. This kind of gets into the tenant's rights, how it's handled by the landlord, and then any time periods. So what do you see here, panelists, that you would change, add, subtract for your client?
Well, generally, the way I look at it is this is one of the most onerous clauses often in a lease in the landlord's favor. And I can understand why. And usually if there is damage to the premises of the tenant, the landlord or the building, landlord has certain termination rights. They can decide whether they want to rebuild the space or the building if it financially makes sense, or they get the insurance proceeds. What happens if they don't? They have the right to terminate the lease. It's a very one-sided termination right to the landlord. So what I try to do is even it out. So in other words, I put language in here that states that to the extent that tenant can't utilize or even access their space to conduct business for 180 days from the date of damage, not from when the landlord starts reconstructing the building, but from the date of damage, the tenant 30 days notice can terminate the lease. It's a very important clause, whether it's whatever that termination timeframe is, whether it's 180 or 270, giving the tenant some kind of out if they can't conduct business is essential, because most of these clauses don't allow the tenant to do that unless you change it yourself.
Yeah, and I actually had a building about 1.5 years ago catch fire. It was a multi-tenant kind of retail industrial building. It was one suite that was an inline suite. And while the fire didn't spread to the other suites outside of the one suite that the tenant occupied, there was smoke damage throughout other spaces in the building. And it also released asbestos. And so as you could imagine, the whole building had to be shut down for a period of time. This clause for the landlord wasn't written correctly. And actually a lot of the tenants were able to just close doors and stay within their lease, even though the landlord felt that they should have been able to get them out of the lease. So having a bilateral ability to terminate in the event of fire, I think is absolutely important, because even though the fire may not have been in your space, there's repercussions from that fire that you may not want to be in that building or near where that fire happened, because of either the construction that's going to happen to fix or repair that space, or other materials, fire, smoke, environmental hazards that happen because of fires in general. So agreed, we really should work on making sure that this is a bilateral ability to terminate.
And further, again, to clarify, if you get that termination right in there, make sure that that termination right ability is enacted not from when the landlord decides they want to recommence the construction or not, but when the actual damage is. If the landlord tweaks this, they'll try to do it in a way that they'll give the tenant the right to terminate, but within a certain amount of time if the landlord hasn't completed construction. But I think as a smart broker, you have to have it from the date of damage, not from the date when the landlord starts to try to rebuild the premises or the building.
Yeah, that one change is brilliant, Jeff. So the date of damage, not when they decide to start.
Correct.
The damage. Yeah.
Correct.
And 180 seems pretty giving. So, that's a great point as well. So 12.2, kind of along the same lines. What do we think here? Do you insert anything special in terms of helping the client to move? Do you like these option periods within 90 days after the occurrence of damage? Do you think that's fair?
Natalie, the first thing I'll say is landlord's reasonable opinion. this is totally up to the landlord, and to Jessica's point earlier, it needs to be both ways. So the landlord isn't the one with the only say here. The tenant has to have a say too, because this affects them and their business.
Okay. That is a great point. Yes, because who's to say what the landlord's opinion is and what they're basing off of?
Yeah, anytime the landlord's opinion is in a lease, go ahead and strike it. Like there's no reasonable, that means nothing.
I say term reasonable is definitely not
Yeah, that's
quite
that gray
reasonable.
area term that it literally has to be interpreted by a judge. I mean, you just don't want to have to go
Absolutely.
that far to go get that interpretation. So anytime there you see someone's opinion, landlord or tenant opinion, just go ahead and redline that out.
And what would you replace it with?
In this case, definitely a bilateral ability. And you want to tie it to a timeline, or, definitely to a timeline. You've already got timelines in this particular section. So get rid of that and probably tie it to the amount of damage, or perhaps maybe to an insurance adjustment. So if there is an adjuster comes in and claims X amount of damage to the property, then that would be, so you want something firm. You just don't want it. It needs to have something tied to it.
Yeah, either an amount or something.
Yep.
Okay.
And from my experience, it's virtually impossible unless you have a very, very large tenant. It takes at least 25 to 30% of a building to be able to make a change that we're talking about right now to this particular article. I mean, anything smaller than that, the landlord's not going to agree to. It's going to be always in their opinion. And at the end of the day, if the tenant disagrees with it, there is damage and they dispute it, then that's, as we said, going to fall in whatever a judge thinks is reasonable. But if I was a landlord, I wouldn't change this unless I was at risk of losing somebody who's going to take 25 to 30% of my building.
Well, thank God you're not a landlord rep there. And Tim Farley makes a great point that reasonable is better than sole as well. But yeah, I'm with you, Jessica. I mean, reasonable opinion is just can be, read so many different ways. So abatement, section 12.3, termination. This is if the result of the damage renders the tenant's business, they can't open up shop, they can't work as normal. So that's saying the rent shall be reduced. Hopefully it's going to let me get to the top. What do you guys say on this in terms of rental abatements? And I know it's hard to read as we go.
I think it's hard to take a firm position on this. I think more important than abatement is just the outright termination on an outside date.
Right.
You can solve for a period of time. I think it's the uncertainty that you're not certain of. So in the scope of things, when you could walk away and hand the keys back is more critical than how many days of free rent you can get. At the end of the day, you could not pay rent and then litigate it separately.
Right.
But being able to walk away for an obligation has an enormous value.
Okay. So your suggestion there would just be, forget the abatement, get me the heck out of here. So strengthen that language. And again,
push for both, but then trade the abatement for the termination.
Okay. And I want to make sure, because we have a lot of new people in the audience, you really always want to recommend that your client gets a real estate attorney, not their brother that does injury law.
A true real estate attorney.
Yes. A real estate attorney. And I think in all, I have one right now where attorneys blow up deals all the time. It's part and parcel for the career that we've all chosen. But you need to have a real estate specific attorney reviewing this lease because you're not an attorney. So while we're going through this, we're looking for business terms to the lease. We're not looking for anything that's legal about the lease. And you really want to be careful when you're giving advice on that and make it clear that you're not an attorney for liability reasons.
Yeah, and to that point, I would say when you're going through this, through a lease with a tenant, which you will, inevitably it happens, you get the questions, but really what you're trying to do is perhaps guide the tenant towards, or your landlord towards, what questions really should be answered by their attorney, and give them some high level advice as to, hey, here's our common things I see in leases, here, and here. You should really discuss these points first and foremost with your attorney before you get into the nitty gritty. I will say the fire portion of the lease Do we see fires happen all the time on buildings? Not really. It's very few and far between. So is that one of those clauses that you should pay attention to? Yes. But at the end of the day, should that be breaking a deal? Be cognitive of what is actually, and attorneys will say every single point of the lease is must be addressed and is so important, but the reality and the scope of will most tenants ever incur having a fire at their building? They probably not. The probability just isn't there, but they should know what happens if that were to happen, right? And that's really all you're trying to do, is put some fail safes in there in this worst case scenario. But I think people tend to kind of hone in on things such as fire, and they go, or eminent domain, as we're going to go into next, and they go, oh my gosh, this is going to happen. Well, these aren't things that are going to happen. We're talking about what could happen in worst cases. So just to kind of give a higher level on some of these things we're going through.
Yes, exactly. Because it can be overwhelming and you think, oh my God, how am I possibly? So just so you can put it, what you want to give and take from the landlord. And like Jeff said, if you're repping a 3,000 square foot tenant in a massive project that's 1.2 million square feet, make sure that your standards are adjusted. You set the right expectations for your client, and don't expect a landlord to change their entire lease for you. Not that that's not a big client. Okay, moving on. Eminent domain, section 13. Anything here in 13.1 or 13.2 to high level touch on?
Kind of like the alterations conversation, I would say, first off, know who your tenant is and know where that property is located. Is that property going to be something that potentially is going to be affected by eminent domain? Is it sitting in an area where the city is redeveloping? Is it sitting in an area where there are freeway or infrastructure changes that are planned? Do you have a new train line? For example, in the Bay Area, we have BART, and BART tends to cause some eminent domain issues as they continue to expand the areas and stations they go into. So first and foremost, before you get too strong into eminent domain, look at the property and kind of size it up. Is this something is going to be super applicable to this particular deal? And then from there, we can kind of get into it. And eminent domain takes a very long time. So if you're talking about a 5-year deal, the chances of a city coming through with an eminent domain is probably fairly low. Now, if you have a 10-year lease, okay, you really should start looking more into these sections here. And so that's where, from a high level, where I would start with eminent domain and then kind of move into the language.
Anybody have anything to add? Jessica, you are the bomb. You are all the bomb, but I'm really happy that you're able to join us today.
Eminent domain, unfortunately, I've had too much use of this part of the lease.
Oh, you really? We'll have to do stories after. We can do like some horror story. We'll do a whole panel on horror story.
I swear, if there is more complicated, like I get hit with the most complicated deals and I don't understand why. I see all these, I watch every deal come through our office. I'm the broker of record. And it's so funny. I watch all these like really cool industrial deals that are on 6-page leases and are done in a matter of 2 weeks that are like 50,000 square feet. And I'm like, why can't I get a deal like that? I've been pounding my head against a wall for like 9 months on a restaurant deal that's 2,500 square feet. So yeah,
yes, it's the smaller, the more issues there are. Yes,
absolutely. It is so true. The smaller the lease, the more involved and the more issues do come up. Yeah, it's absolutely true.
No, so anything to add from eminent domain from our other panelists that you think would be of value? Okay, we're going into assignment and subletting. This is an important one. So we're going to head into generals, and then there's a whole other area. So I don't think that you're getting out of it after this one paragraph. What is important to us to make sure is inserted into the lease or that's not there when we're negotiating this portion, which is our tenant's right to sublease while they're in this space? Landlord hereby reserves the right to receive any increased rental value of the premises during the term. What do we think about that? We keep that in there?
No, especially if the tenant, let's say again, it's a dentist. I'll use that as an example. Somebody who's put, especially if they paid for their own TI. If you had a really heavy landlord contribution, let's say the landlord did throw in a $50 to $70, $80 plus TI, maybe then there's some share. But if you have a tenant who has put in substantial amount of TI on their own, this is something I move to strike, because the landlord shouldn't be able to profit off of the tenant's improvements to the space, especially if you're taking a space from a blank box to a very improved space that has additional value because of those improvements. So I would try to strike these. Obviously, landlords are really tough on this particular section right now, especially because they feel a lot of leases have been locked in under market. And we're seeing such, especially where I am, we're seeing some big jumps in rents, especially if you're, say, in the industrial market. So they want to get their piece of the pie. So it's a harder one to negotiate, but again, where it becomes important is if the tenant has put substantial amount of money into TI that has made the space more valuable for future tenants, or a sublet or signer.
I look at that too, Jessica, and obviously the landlord, if the space is under market, the landlord has a recapture right anyway. So, they can play that game if they want to and take back the space and lease it at a higher rate. The TIs they've already put into the space are being paid for by the tenant at a higher rate anyway than the sublease. Yeah. The way I modify this is that, I don't mind sharing quote unquote profit with the landlord, so long as my client can deduct his or her related costs associated with the subleasing or assignment of the premises, such as legal fees, broker commissions, even downtime, landlord fees, et cetera. And it would be on a 50-50 split basis. And as long as we can deduct our fees. Some leases will actually have language in there that I've seen. And Gabe, I don't know about you, if you've seen it in New York, where I've seen leases which will state that in no event, however, can tenants sublease or assign the space at a lower value rental number than what they're then currently paying, which is insane. That doesn't make any sense. How do you, or they might say no less than 90% of what tenant is currently paying. Well, most subleases, you get 50 cents on the dollar if you're lucky anyway. So that doesn't make any sense.
If you're advising a tenant, your whole approach around the sublease and assignment provision should be to take the landlord's viewpoint and understand where the landlord is going to be worse off. And in any case where the landlord is not worse off, they should grant you the right. You should have the right to sublease to who you want to sublease. You should have the right to a reasonable time frame for them to give consent. You should be able to lease the space at the rates that you want to lease it at. And yes, you're not in the profit game. You don't want to be a professional landlord. And so if there happens to be profit, I think I've been part of one of those instances in my career, you'll share it after expenses are deducted at a 50-50 rate. Mm-hmm. But the landlords want to be able to say, all right, can we take a look under the hood and understand the financials of the incoming entity? They have that right. It's their building. They want to be able to understand if they have costs associated with the review of a subtenant. You should pay for that. That's okay too. But they shouldn't be overly restrictive, and that's the key. And that's where you start to bristle.
Yep.
The landlord likes to put a couple of conditions in there on the subleasing too, and assignments such as, you can't sublease or assign to an existing tenant in the building, which doesn't make any sense because the most likely backfill of a sublease or assignment is going to be somebody in the shadow of the space, which meaning a neighbor of the tenant. And so that's most likely. If somebody hires me to sublease their space, first people I'm going to go to are the tenants next door, up above them, to the side of them, and below them. And number one. Number two, the landlords will put language in there that you can't sublease or assign to anybody that the landlord is speaking to or may have spoken with in the last, say, prior 6 months, which is ridiculous. We strike that kind of language.
Yeah, that's a big one, guys. So when this is on YouTube, go back and rewind on this part, and really re-listen to everything that was just mentioned to protect your clients, because everything that just happened does get inserted into lease. This lease is kind of a mom and pop lease that I selected for fear of, obviously leases are confidential. I'm not going to use a Blackstone lease or a Hines or any of those big guys, but make sure you go back and listen to what was just said on what should be inserted and struck to really protect your clients, because subleases happen all the time and they could be completely locked in and screwed if you don't do your job. Excuse my mouth. Okay.
Jeff, so you nailed that one. There were so many good points you threw in there about tenants that you should be able to reach out to. I mean, those are huge. That's such a great, valid point.
And a lot of these conditions apply mostly if you're going to sublease or assign your entire space. If you're a large law firm, 15, 20,000 feet, and you want to assign or sublease a portion of your space, say 20, 25% or less, then I would argue that we should have some kind of language in here that carves that out, where the tenant doesn't necessarily have to go to the landlord to jump through hoops for all these conditions.
Jeff, how do you feel about the provision in certain subleases or some leases regarding subleasing where the landlord can take on the sublease agency. They represent the building, they should be able to represent subleases.
I don't know. I don't normally allow that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a conflict of interest, right?
Right.
Why would they go lease out their sublease space and when you're on the hook? I don't think that's ever a good idea. You should always, if you're subleasing, you should be able to go choose your own agent and make sure that that person's actually
Yeah.
properly marketing
The
the
highest
space.
use of the landlord's time isn't to sublease your client's space.
Correct.
It's
100%.
the least direct space that he or she's got to try to lease for the investors of the building.
And are they probably going to represent your tenant because they want to lease up their space and they want to control that process? The other thing is on a sublease, if you are going to turn the space over to like a sister company, it shouldn't really be considered a sublease if it's another affiliate of the company, the parent company that it has signed the lease.
Yeah.
So you should have the language in there that allows you to do that.
I don't
Yeah.
see it. Oh, that
You
And
just
you can see
muted
even
yourself.
in 14.4, you've got your partnership in aggregate of 25%. I mean, I normally try and bump that number to 50%.
Yeah. Natalie, you're on mute.
I had to mute myself. I'm at the pleasures of being at home with a toilet flushing. God, it's like you can't make it up.
The best life.
It is. It's life with kids during the summer.
Just add so much more
so-
excitement to our day because we didn't have enough already.
Right? This is so much fun. What about when landlords insist that you pay their legal fees, any legal fees that are tied to the client subleasing? Do you put any blocks on that?
Reasonable fees.
Reasonable fees.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll put reasonable, but then I'll try to cap that amount because frankly,
too.
there's a little bit of double dipping there. And the landlord's normal and customary management responsibilities of a building are reviewing subleases and assignments, and they charge a fee to the building to do that, in the operating expenses, 10 to 15%. So to also charge a fee, it's just another profit center. So I try to minimize. If it's an actual legal fee, yeah, but if it's, sometimes they'll just have, hey, you have to pay X percent to the landlords or $1,000, $2,000 to the landlord to review a sublease, which they may or may not approve. Doesn't seem reasonable to me.
I always try to cap those fees as well, just simply because what is reasonable.
Okay, great point. Yes, and I had never considered that reason behind capping the legal fees, that it's already part of their management fees. So that is a great point, Jeff Tabor. Thank you, thank you. So section 15, landlords reserved rights, right of entry. Let's start with that one. This one's pretty straightforward, how you should be protecting your client. Who wants to hit this one?
I tweaked this to say we require at least 24-hour notice unless it's an emergency or to furnish normal and customary janitorial services. The way it's written here is they can come in anytime they want, although it says reasonable, but again, they can come in anytime they want.
Yeah,
I
make
do
sure
the exact same thing.
Yeah.
language in here, guys, and say written notice and email, and just add that email is fine, but there, it should be written notice, because I've had it happen recently where PMs are sending people, it's not in writing, they're not sending it to the decision makers, it's to somebody in the, that's in the office, and it's just a, what show. So just insert some language in here just to cover your bases. 24-hour notice, written, email's fine, or electronic is fine, and it's pretty easy to protect your client.
Guys, the key with this provision, you only read this provision if things aren't going well with your landlord. Otherwise, you don't care. So make sure you're tight on this.
Right.
Okay. Yes, there's a couple of clauses that your client will only look at when stuff has gone sideways. And Lord, do you want to be able to say, hey, thank God you had a good tenant rep broker that looked out for you.
Natalie, stop one second though. The 90 days to show to prospective tenants. That's always an interesting clause too.
Ooh, yes, let's hit that. So that's in this clause as well, that should you not give notice that you are going to renew your lease, that they have the right to show prospective clients during the last 90 days. How do we protect them? What do we insert? What is the notice period? Do we have to be on site? What do we do here?
I try to get it shortened to 60 days, being honest.
I like 30, but.
Yeah, I mean, landlords are going to get pushback on that, but again, it's that reasonable notice to the tenant, and it should be during working hours. unless you request otherwise. So if you have a
unless tenant
business,
requests otherwise, yeah.
yeah, if you have a business where you don't want someone in your business between 9 and 5, then that should be pre-written in here ahead of time. But you get into other companies where they want to make sure that they have one of their people on the tour, because if there's proprietary information, they want to protect that and protect the ability for somebody to walk through that's actually a competitor that's in there taking pictures in their space. So, you know, especially if you have a company that has, you know, an element of confidentiality, you know, you got to tighten up this language right away.
Yeah, and I'll say, hopefully this isn't language that needs to be used in the future, but during COVID, and there were a lot of businesses that frankly didn't want people in their space. They only had certain employees, and they did request. I mean, I did many of tours where I did one where I was fully suited up and I had glasses and gloves and temperature. I mean, you name it, we had to do the whole routine just to get through the space. So making sure whether it's after hours or, you know, tours being appropriate to the tenant at that point in time, I think is something we should address in future leases, which we probably didn't address in leases previously before COVID, because we just never really thought about it. But I think those are things that we may need to incorporate going forward, is some discretion on the part of the tenant in terms of hours and responsibilities of those touring.
I'm not a broker,
I'm
so
gonna have to log off for about 10 minutes, but I'll jump back on in about 10 to 15 minutes.
Oh, awesome. We get you back. Okay. We'll be waiting for you, Jeff. Thank you. Okay.
He showers really quickly, I guess.
He has a meeting. So, okay. Building and common areas. Let me see. Well, no, I guess we'll have to stay here. Okay.
just 1 second on this. For the 90 days, I'm not a broker, and maybe you guys can chime in on this, but my clients are always typically very large office tenants, 100,000, 250,000, 500,000 square feet and up. There's no way you're only looking 90 days ahead of time for a space. Usually it's, you know, if you haven't triggered your renewal right, it's 18 to 24 months ahead of the expiry of the lease. So, you know, I would imagine for a larger, more sophisticated lease, this 90 days is not really going to be relevant. And what's going to be more important is the giving notice to the tenant, so that if you've got confidential information around your office, you have the ability to have the staff, your employees, kind of clean up their office areas before a potential competitor comes and tours your space.
And Lance, to your point, if you're that large of a tenant, number one, this language will be duplicated in the renewal options section. And again, the landlord's going to be looking from a landlord perspective. They're going to be looking to have the opportunity to start bringing people in, possibly even a year ahead of time. If it's larger space.
90 days before, this makes no difference.
Right.
It's not long enough of lead time to make a difference.
Right, on smaller spaces, it's probably fine, but on larger space,
exactly.
it would be problematic for the landlord.
Okay, building in common areas. This one is obviously, if you're in a multi-tenant project, you want to make sure that you pay attention to this. I don't see anything here.
The one thing that I typically like to take a look at in this particular section is what goes on outside: parking, entrances, driveways. That to me is the place that I think we see the most, if there were a change to be made, where it can cause the most issues, especially if you are a higher intensity use where you do need a lot of parking, or if you are a more retail-esque where you have people coming into spaces. You don't want the landlord to interfere with your visibility or people's ability to get to you. So I would say, just in general, make sure you're looking at that's where I tend to highlight this section for my potential tenants.
That does make sense, especially on a retail. If all of a sudden they construct a monument sign that completely blocks your space and your building signage, you know, that's a problem. So you definitely.
Yeah. Or let's say it's a building that runs block to block. So you're on First Street and Second Street, and you have an entrance on First Street and an entrance on Second Street. Well, let's say the landlord decides, hey, I'm going to close off this entrance on this street. Now your only entrance and exit is out the Second Street side of the building, and you've changed the flow and the pattern of people being able to get into your space. This is also really applicable in banks. A lot of the bank deals I do, there is really no areas where the landlord can change exteriors so that they can continue to have access to ATMs and getting people into their spaces. So just one of those things to keep an eye out for if you have a tenant who is particular about parking or visibility.
And I'd also insert some language in here that they have to give us notice. So if you're going to shut down the first floor restrooms, let us know that you're going to shut them down. Obviously, if there's an emergency, hey, turn off the pipes. But if you are planning on doing some type of an upgrade cosmetically, give us some notice. So if you want to, you can put some language in there that the landlord must provide, a 7-day notice or whatever that timing is, just so you have time to prepare.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the worst. You go walk down the hall and all of a sudden you have a gutted bathroom and it's locked. You're like, wait, where'd the bathroom go?
You share the floor with the call center and you have to go over their side. I want
Oh
some
my God. Yeah.
mentally prepare myself for what I'm about to experience. So 15.3 name. This one makes sense. They want to be able to change their project, especially here in Vegas. Projects names are changing all the time. I would just say, if anything of that is on my letterhead or any of my marketing, you're going to pay the fee. So you could insert language that, any fees that are associated with the changing of marketing and everything else for the tenant, you just absorb the cost. And usually landlords are pretty amenable to that. Would we all agree?
Yep.
Yeah, in proper
and you may
notice.
even limit it to an amount of, the name change can only occur once every 5 years. I mean, that's a good way to tamp down the costs that may be associated. Not that we see building owners change names of buildings every year, but that's one way to keep that under control.
Especially in a retail park, I would think that would be, really important. Development of improvements. Section 15.4 and section 15.5, incorporation of other improvements. Anything here, panelists, that stands out to you that you'd want to protect?
Probably again, noticed just so that you have reasonable notice so you can let clients know if there's a specific entrance that's going to be blocked and they need to enter the complex a different way or something. But that would be anything.
Yeah, this seems to kind of go into reciprocal access rights and use of properties. Say you've got multiple properties that are all using common driveways or common parking. I think it's always good to at least know what those are. And so maybe if you see this a reciprocal right of access, ask for that REA agreement or whatever that agreement is so that you can understand what is the regulation for the property in terms of reciprocal use. It's not something that I think you need to dive super deep into, but it is good to know where this property ends, where the next one starts. And I think this actually where it becomes a little more important is, let's say in a retail center, we have triple net expenses being passed down. And in your triple nets will be some of these operating expenses. And so if you have another entity that is running the operating expenses for, say, a common area of a parking lot and the landscape, and there isn't really oversight by your landlord, well, now your triple nets are going up because of common area expenses that actually aren't even managed by your own landlord. You should know that going into your lease, because that could adversely affect you throughout the term of your lease if those costs continue to go up.
Great points, Jessica. So that's on 15.4 and 15.5 to do with improvements.
In 15.4, I think you may want to avoid any dispute later on in terms of contradictions with the operating cost language. Just something in there towards the last and very end of that paragraph, 15.4, something to the extent that refers to subject to the operating cost definitions in the lease. So the landlord can't just assume that just because it pays it to another owner who's managing that portion of the property and owns those capital improvements, that it can automatically recover from the tenant. So subject to the operating expense language in the lease.
Okay.
And reference whatever section number it is.
And then call out whatever section that is. Yep.
Yep.
Perfect.
Because landlords love to find any sort of inconsistency, any contradictions, and then you're like, well, do I pay for this? So the biggest thing here is where you have a condominium corporation that owns, and this is where you have often like a mixed retail with residential above and maybe a couple floors of offices mixed in there as well. These newer type of mixed projects. Typically, it'll be a condo corp that receives reserve fund installments and operating installments from the condo owners. And I've seen a number of cases where you have one owner that owns, let's say, 20 retail units for an entire floor of the office condo. And then that owner has a lease with its tenant that allows it to recover all the costs it pays to the condominium corporation, any payments to the condominium corporation, plus its own cost of administering and managing on top of that. And the risk you have is that the operating cost definitions may exclude capital expenses, but then if everything paid to the condo corporation is recoverable, well, there's no use for that exclusion. So just because it's paid to a condo corporate to somebody else, it still has to comply with all of the restrictions or definitions that are within the operating expense section of the lease. So oftentimes you'll find that any reserve fund contributions paid to the condo owner are not allowed, but the operating cost payments are, as an example.
Okay, thank you, Lance. And that's why if your client is large enough, they really should be engaging somebody like Lance and his team, because there's so much in there that your client at the end of their lease or in the middle of their lease could just receive a fat bill because their CAM expenses and everything else were not properly audited or controlled. So definitely something that you want to look at closely. Section 16, identification and limitation on liability.
Yeah, word.
I got it on the third one though. So this goes into the limitations on landlord's liability identity by the landlord and by the tenant. So there's a lot in here to take on. So let's start with 16.1.
This is the one where I always revert to an attorney. I hate getting into indemnity clauses. I really do. There are little nuancy things that get put into these leases and indemnification that can change, really change the way that a lease is interpreted. And I would always suggest this is the first place you send your client to their attorney and have this really reviewed in depth in a lease.
Okay, so you really think that this is one of the main ones where we go, hey, not an attorney, have your attorney check this one out?
Absolutely. This is just one of those. It's so wordy. It is so attorney jargon that I tend to stay out of this particular section and just route it straight on up to the attorney.
I agree. Biggest thing I think though is that it's mutual indemnification, and that your tenant has the rights as well. It's just not landlord sided.
Exactly. And that's how a lot of these are written. They're very landlord based. And unless, you start getting into, gross negligence, the landlord only wants to be involved if it's a gross negligence clause. You have to kind of stay away from those very specific tight terms that they try to use to keep themselves completely out of liability at any point. So really, this is one of those ones I start to read through, and if I start to see, keywords. To me, gross negligence is one of those. Reasonable, or a tenant not having the same coverage. That's where I start to just go, okay, we're going to take this one right on over to the attorney. So this is definitely a clause that I always send to the attorney.
Okay, and then Tim Farley, if possible, always try to get identity mutual mirrored language, meaning I think we would take 16.1 and combine it into one, and it would just be mirrored language on both sides. Am I reading that correctly?
That's always the try, right? But it's tough. I've done deals with some larger banks and smaller landlords and bigger landlords and banks. And this always seems to be what it comes down to in the lease is these indemnifications and liabilities. Literally, I can name 5 leases right now off the top of my head where the final things we were talking about were this particular section.
Okay.
Subordination.
Yes. Okay. Section 17, sale by landlord. And it's going to go on to the next page. So this discusses if the landlord sells the building while your tenant is there. You want to make sure that you protect them in some ways. This is just saying that they are relieved of any and all of their obligations once they sell the property.
Yeah, so a couple things that I keep into this. I think it's very likely that buildings do sell during a lease, especially if it's a 5-year or 10-year lease. So I would pay particular attention to this in terms of how that creates adjustments in base years in taxes. And then also if there's any commissions that are still outstanding when the property trades, I try to make sure that commissions are paid by the previous owner before upon the close of escrow. And I actually write this into my listing agreements as well, because I have had where, a property trades and your previous landlord goes, oh, no, they're going to pay you. And then they say, oh, no, you were supposed to pay, and you end up in this back and forth. So I try to make sure that when a property does trade, everything's as clean as possible. And that goes all the way down to commissions and everything kind of in between.
And where would you insert that language about commissions? Would it be in what section would that?
Yeah, so I would, if you are on the tenant rep side of things, see, if you're on the landlord rep, you should have this in your listing agreement, is building trades, any commissions that are outstanding need to be paid up at that point in time, whether or not the tenant has taken possession of the space. If the lease is executed, then the whole deal should be made payable upon close of escrow. If you're on the tenant side of things, it gets a little more murky. I would probably make sure, especially if it's a tenant of size, and this is a commission of value, that you have a separate commission letter with the landlord that is executed. And that goes to also include what happens in the case of a sale. And when I'm generally representing a tenant, I always send a commission letter, a commission agreement out to be executed by both the tenant and the landlord.
By the tenant? Why would a tenant sign your commission?
Or excuse me, not tenant, the broker and landlord.
Okay. So
Their
a
broker.
commissions agreement to the landlord. I can tell you that my agreement does not say that commissions are due and payable upon a sale, especially it doesn't say regardless if the tenant has taken occupancy. So that is a pearl that Jessica just gave us all to add to your commissions agreements.
And I'll give you a nice example of this. I did a deal with a regional pizza company. They took about 3,500 square feet in a 2-tenant building. There's a Bank of America in there. It was a larger owner, West Coast owner who owns multiple buildings. But what ended up happening, and we kind of knew this was an issue going into it, would be a hurdle, is that the building didn't have the proper power. And in order to pull the proper power, the whole transformer had to be upgraded in front of the building. Well, by the time PG&E got in there and upgraded the power to the transformer and then into the building, it was an 18-month process. In that 18 months, the building traded hands. And so the tenant ended up getting a day for day in terms of tenant improvement or time to improve the space. So they got an extra 18 months to complete tenant improvements because of this big delay. Well, that now meant that my commission was pushed out 36 months from the time the lease was signed. So thankfully I had this clause in there. So when the building did trade, I was able to get paid on the deal because everything was going as nobody was in default of the lease. It was simply that these timelines had been pushed out. So since then, and there's been a couple other deals that I won't go into the length of deal time, but there are deals that I have found that drag out for 2 and 3 years, especially when they're more intense uses. And I found this to be a very useful clause to have in some of these listing agreement or tenant rep agreements or commission agreements.
That is absolutely brilliant. I literally just wrote it down. I am including that in my commission's agreements as a tenant rep. So thank you for that. Does anybody else have anything to add on the sale of a property, either for you as your broker to protect yourself or to protect your client? And we're going to get into some more language, obviously, here. Okay. So section 18.1 and 18 so the rest of, let's just go through all of 18. Attornment. What is attornment, guys? It sounds like somebody's writing. Does anybody else hear that noise?
I do.
Writing
like
on
scribbling.
Board.
Like a scribble.
Yeah, I don't know what that noise is though. It doesn't look like any of you are writing. I'm trying to figure it out.
So a little static. Don't worry, it's fine.
Yeah, it sounds like somebody's like taking notes. Like, okay. Anything to add here, or is this something we throw over to the landlord?
Attorney.
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 Yeah. I mean, your SNDAs and non-disturbance agreements, I mean, that's pretty standard language in the attorney, but typically I have the landlord review this, or excuse me, the attorney review this section as well.
Okay. And
Especially in coordination.
estoppel certificates.
Yeah, we can talk for a long time about this.
Estoppels.
Yeah.
Well,
This
let's
could
keep
be
it
very
high
interesting.
level, but somebody explain what an estoppel certificate is, first of all, very high level to somebody that's new to brokerage, so we don't make their head explode.
An
So
estoppel, yeah, sorry, Lance. An estoppel is very simply, it's a statement that a landlord asks a tenant to sign off on if they need a tenant to confirm, for instance, that they're a tenant in the building. So it could be a one-pager that says, we lease X amount of space, we pay this rent with this expiration, and the landlord would usually do that if they're looking to sell the building, refinance, or make some sort of financial decision about the asset. And they need the tenant to affirm that they are in the space or doing certain things. I don't spend a lot of time on estoppels. When a landlord issues it, it's usually a good way to hold it hostage if you need their attention on something. But I don't spend a lot of time on it in the lease.
So
Yeah.
I put on a conference a number of years ago, and when it came down to estoppel certificates, the estoppel discussion of the 1.5 hour long conference there were like 10 topics, but estoppel certificates took more than a half an hour of debate, and I had a number of lawyers on the panel as well, and they were yelling at each other.
Yes.
Fantastic.
It was the most dramatic subject that I didn't think would get that much attention. But I tell you, estoppel certificates for my clients, it's a huge, huge headache. What the landlord is asking them to do is sign off on their life when they sign back an estoppel certificate, because and particularly for the more complex leases, you can appreciate that. Put yourself in the tenant's position where you occupy 500,000 square feet in a building across maybe 20 separate leases with a number of different amendments for each lease.
Yep.
The client's time it's going to take just to do the verification that they're referring to all the right number of original leases on the amendments that have happened over the years is a huge time-consuming process. Then they have to sign off that all the improvement allowances have been paid and received. So they have to go verify that. Then they have to go find out if the landlord has been issuing the additional rent reconciliations on time, and have they been audited, and are there any disputes that are underway. There's a lot of due diligence that a tenant has to go through in order to sign back an estoppel certificate properly. And oftentimes what happens is an estoppel certificate comes to reception. Reception sits on it for a while, and then they pass it on to, maybe accounting. Accounting doesn't know what to do with it. Then it makes its way to, to finance, and then it makes its way to internal legal. By the time it's circulated to the right person in the company to respond, there's not enough time left to respond by the date. So the best estoppel certificate clause is one that's not there, to be honest with you, where there's no obligation of the tenant to sign an estoppel certificate. When the landlord issues one, the tenant can decide if it wants to issue one. I use estoppel certificates as an incredible tool where a building is being refinanced or sold, and there's an audit in process with a material pending claim that's unresolved. You get attention, and we've used estoppel certificates as a way to add leverage to the closure of our dispute. But to sign off on your life as a tenant that there's absolutely no issues with the lease and the landlord is in full compliance, it's a huge undertaking for tenants. So consider even having the tenant recover its out-of-pocket costs on responding to an estoppel certificate. Imagine the landlord issues you a estoppel certificate 2 years into a lease, and then it looks at selling the building, but the sale doesn't go through. So every year thereafter, there could be another estoppel certificate request. It could be onerous.
Yeah. I would say most tenants call it 10,000 square feet and under. You'll probably, if the building were to sell or refi, you will see an estoppel certificate. Most of the time, especially in the AIR leases, it does call that the landlord may self-execute in the event the tenant does not return the estoppel certificate within a specific time period. I believe in the AIR, it's 21 days. It might be 30 days. So they're estoppel certificates definitely are something that are paying for tenants. There's no question about it. But the other premise, I think that what we have to keep in mind is their estoppel certificates are there to protect tenants as well. Because let's say you've been working with your landlord and your landlord has said, hey, look, you're going to get discounted rent for a couple months because this came up or whatever it is. And you don't have written agreement of that, but you have a handshake agreement. Well, that estoppel certificate is your place as a tenant to be able to say, no, wait a minute, you're going to sell the building. I have X amount of free rent left or deducted rent because of this handshake we did here. So estoppel certificates aren't always 100% in the landlord's favor. If you are a tenant and there is an agreement out there that isn't written, this is your chance to make sure that that agreement's going to be held to moving forward. It could even be an option that was a handshake option agreement that maybe the new owner doesn't want to agree to that new option period that you and the landlord already had a discussion on. So making sure that you have the pieces in place kind of before they actually sell the property is in the tenant's interest as well. So I think that, estoppel certificates, if you're under 10,000 square feet, they're a necessary evil. It's going to happen. Maybe protect yourself so you aren't completing multiple estoppel certificates each year. But it is also a place where a tenant can maybe pick their head out of the sand because they've been busy running a business and go, oh, wait, hold on. There is an agreement that was made here that isn't reflected in our lease. So keep that in mind as you look through estoppel certificates and as you
Ideally, what happens is when the best advice you can give your clients is to have a plan in place for when an estoppel certificate request comes through.
Yeah.
There needs to be a defined sequence of personnel within the organization and perhaps outside that need to touch and see that estoppel certificate before it goes back. My most sophisticated public company clients, oftentimes what happens is the estoppel certificate finds its way to legal. Legal reviews it from a legal perspective, not understanding the business need to perhaps use leverage in the estoppel, and signs it back blind. And that is very, very dangerous. So
that makes people really happy. That makes people really happy.
Yeah,
in operations.
There's been missed opportunities, and again, blood boils. My blood boils. The VP real estate that I would be dealing with at that client's blood boils. Really, the best thing to do is plan ahead. So have a procedure in place where, depending on the size of your organization, how much internal bandwidth and resources you have, maybe it needs to go to outside counsel, needs to get approved by the CFO, needs to get approved by internal legal, needs to be approved by the broker. Maybe you ask your real estate agent to have a look at this and see if they have any advice. It's a real opportunity, as Jessica correctly points out, to use it as leverage to get things rectified with your landlord while they have your attention.
There's so many good points here, and so many of us as their brokers, we get lost in the weeds because this is what we do every day, and we forget that the client, they have a business to run and they don't know what an estoppel is and what to do. And I love when my clients reach out to me, hey, I got this estoppel certificate, what do I need to do? And so a lot of times clients don't think to involve you and they navigate the waters on themselves. So Lance had an excellent point. Set the tone when you're in leases, and when you close the deal. Hey, you might get one of these dollars to donuts, you got a long-term lease, they're going to sell, the building's going to trade. When you get this notice, let me know. And as Tim Farley said over in the notes, and as Bob Gibbons said, I don't think that I'm going to go ahead and read what Bob Gibbons said. He said, estoppels are often wrong, so they should be reviewed carefully when received. but agree there is nothing to negotiate when the lease is signed. I've used them to resolve issues with landlords when they are desperate to get financing or a sale closed. I've done the same. I think we've all done it on this panel. That is a great time to represent your client. Not necessarily to ever hold your landlord hostage, but to say, hey, remember that roof leak that we've been going back and forth on, or whatever you can do to take care of your client. And then we have Patrice that typed in, also with estoppel certificates, a new tenant may not have the answers if they're still building out their suite and there is not a set rent commencement date, TI, et cetera, determined. Also need to know who and where to send the estoppel. Great point. And Bob said hostage is good. You know what, Bob, I like the way you do business.
Bob, no holds barred, Bob, going at it.
You're not going to hear that from me being recorded. But yes, obviously leverage. That's our entire job, right? Leverage. So, oh, I got some leverage here. So estoppels are given when the landlord is trying to sell and they need to get that from each tenant. And so if you've got some leverage that you can create for your client, then is the time. But letting them know that that certificate's going to come and what the plan in place is really helpful, because it goes to the office manager. They don't know what day it is, and then you're too late to the table.
So some free advice as well. Check with your internal counsel on this. But my understanding is that, and what I've been advised by the legal community, you need to be very careful who the estoppel is addressed to. So if you're looking to have this leverage that we talked about, using it as an opportunity to rectify some wrongs or deficiencies, if the estoppel is only addressed to the existing landlord, it's not going to do you any good. The estoppel, if you want another party to be held accountable to what you add into the estoppel, they need to be addressed on the estoppel. So in the event of a building sale, it's not good enough that the estoppel is addressed to the existing owner. The estoppel needs to be addressed to the existing owner and the prospective purchaser, or else the estoppel is not going to help you with the prospective purchaser. And when you come to them a year down the road and say, look, there's all these TIs that were not paid, I'm coming to you now. And the new owner says, what do you mean? I never got a copy of the estoppel. It wasn't addressed to me. I'm not bound by what you wrote there. Or
that's an excellent point. Yep, their name
you really need to be careful with these things.
Yep, dot your I's. Any loophole in business that can be found, it will be found. So excellent point. And we had Tim had some great points over there too. So, and I keep using the word broker for all of us, but we're really advisors. That's really what we are. It's our job.
You need a team for anything important. You need a team of professionals. So I'm not a broker and never will be. I respect the profession, but I'm focusing on lease audit.
Yeah.
But whenever I advise my clients who try to tell me, look, I'm in the premises already. I've been here for 20 years. I'm just going to do the renewal directly with the landlord. I shake, because they need to go to the broker. They're not getting a better deal by doing the deal directly, but they could be missing out and they could be messing a lot of stuff up. So you need the professionals involved at every stage of the lease, whether it be executing a lease, negotiating a lease, or dealing with an estoppel certificate or anything else that comes up along the way. You need to have the right.
But they get together, their kids play t-ball together. It's going to be a better deal if they just negotiate it together. They've been there for 20 years. They don't need a broker. So
this is a little funny story. When I was just getting started, we used to have a pitch competition at Savills, and we were pitching a CEO of an organization, a phantom organization. And the CEO was, of course, a senior executive within our company. And so I walk in and immediately they were hostile. And they said to me something along the same lines, Natalie, but the exact quote was, we are best friends with the building manager. Our kids play badminton together. And I'm like, badminton together? Said, well, then they can't be that close of a friend. And then the whole room kind of broke out into laughter. But I mean, it's a real thing. And for the junior people who are still on, if you want to understand what kind of value you ever bring to the table, first thing you learn how to do is calculate your commission. What percentage of the deal is your commission? And if you can't add more percentage value than that, then you shouldn't be in the game. In New York, on a 10-year deal, it's 3%. If I'm not adding 3% of value, then what am I doing? It's a pretty low threshold.
That is such a great point. I like that. And what a great thing thing to say in a pitch as well. Ooh, we're going to do a pitch new to CRE panel. Ooh, and guess who I'm going to make be the front runner there, Mr. You. Yeah, you. All right. From
Hey,
Savills.
Natalie, if
That
I
was-
can add to Gabe's comment.
Yeah.
When someone tells me that, hey, I'm really good friends with the landlord, we'll do this directly. My comment is, but let me help you maintain that friendship, because I can get bruised and battered in the fight for you to get you the best deal and to protect you. And you can maintain that relationship. I'll walk away. You can keep your relationship, but at the same time, you'll get a good deal.
So I'm the bad guy. Yeah.
Yep.
What a great way to say that. But let me help you maintain that friendship. Yeah. That's great, because their fiduciary is always going to be to themselves. So let's lose the, the Pollyanna look on your face when you get an amendment and your rates increased and, no TIs are offered and everything else. So we had hit the 11:30 mark. We are ending with the estoppel certificates, which I thought, hey, we'll just gloss right over, and no, that's not what happened. So I hope that everybody got as much value as I did. This will be available on YouTube as soon as I get it uploaded. And just thank you so much to everybody on this panel and everybody in the chat. I thank these panelists when you have the opportunity for their time and expertise, and they're here purely to be just to give back to our industry. They are the busiest in the top of their industries, and here they are for us. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
You are not an attorney. Just keep that in mind. You're an advisor. Just as Natalie pointed out, you're just trying to guide the ship in a little more clear way and give some a path and good direction so that you can help tie all the pieces together from your tenant or the landlord to their attorney, and help the tenant or the landlord really sort through the comments that come back from their attorney, because a lot of attorneys will go through with a red pen and mark up every single line, and that isn't realistic when you're actually trying to make a deal. So if you can point out the areas where you can say, hey, this is an area of need, this is an area of need, this may not, eminent domain likely won't be involved in this deal, or you can start crossing off some of these areas that may be less important so you can really focus down to what is most important in the deal. You'll find that your lease negotiations will go a lot smoother. So yeah, just remember, you're not an attorney, you're an advisor, and you're just doing your best to guide the ship.
Oh, Mr. Tabor, I didn't see you were back.
Thank you.
Just in time to say goodbye to everybody.
Oh.
I don't know how long.
Welcome and goodbye.
Welcome back. But great points, Jessica. So thank you for that. And thank you for joining us. Miss Kim Ford was unable to make it. And I immediately thought of you, because you are, your energy behind it and the passion, and then obviously your expertise. It's like, as soon as you start talking, like I said, my phone's just been, who is this Jessica? And I'm like, yeah, exactly. So,
well, I'm so glad you thought of me. I'm honored to be joining this panel today. Y'all are amazing. So I appreciate everybody's time, and I'm so glad to join all of you.
Heck yeah. Thank you so
for
much.
having me, Natalie. This has been a lot of fun. And I think that the one takeaway that I get from this is just, there's a saying, you can't afford the cheapest solution. But here, with all the professional advice that you've seen, the banter we've had, the landlord pays for the broker commission. My fees are contingent, on after the fact on the audit side. You're not expending money to have all this knowledge as a tenant. Use it. Why would you try to do it yourself? Look at the debate we're having here, and imagine if you were trying to do this on your own without the professionals guiding you.
That's such a great point. It's such a great point, Lance. Any other closing? And Claire, thank you so much. You're so wonderful.
So welcome.
And Gabe, and Jeff, thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.